You can start talking, Ted, anytime you want. You know, I wanted actually Julie to interview you.
Yeah, she's going to come back in just a moment.
Yeah.
So you're checking your audio levels, you mean?
Yeah. What I'm doing right now is my video levels, because I don't have an independent audio sound.
Oh, right.
Although with that camera, I need to buy a Canon external mic because it's got a shoe.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well. I'll wait. I could wait for Julie, or do you want me to begin talking now? Can you get enough of what you need from what I'm doing?
No, start talking now.
Start talking. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have here before us the early generation, the first generation of Wendelle Stevens' books, the coffee table books that he produced called UFO Contact from the Pleiades, volumes 1 and 2, which are extraordinary collector's items today, if you can find them at all. Probably worth $1,000 each on the market.
Yeah, you know, as I told you earlier, be honest, Richard never gave me anything for free. Yeah. But he got the UFO Contact from the Pleiades for me years ago. That was Richard Dillon, and kind of alerted me to this whole tradition.
Yeah, well, these were a very small, limited production run of probably 1,000 copies that sold out immediately, and they were so expensive. Wendelle probably went into the hole so deeply on producing this small edition that he never was able to do it again. And of course, he probably had so many other projects that he never really was able to get back to it. But what I've been able to do, in some ways, with these original books in mind, these beautiful coffee table edition books of Genesis publication, the Wendelle Stevens publication group in Arizona, was to take Wendelle's other major book series from the Billy Meier story, the Message from the Pleiades, which was the contact notes of Billy Meier, and basically turn them into a kind of hybrid version of the coffee table book and the original black and white publication book that was, I would call, a distressed manuscript that still got published, but was not really ever finished exactly. And I was able to take Wendelle's two versions of the manuscript and turn it into a color picture book with about 60 color illustrations for each volume, and produce that as a kind of very latter-day companion piece for the early coffee table books.
Well, speaking of the color pictures, I mean, when this is available online, what kind of resolution is it in?
Well, it looks pretty good. The ones I've seen,
Yeah.
They are proprietary file formats for the different e-readers, the Kindle and so forth, for laptops. But it looks pretty good. It's on a small screen. It's formatted for a small screen, so it looks fairly choppy. Nonetheless, it is readable, and the text looks pretty good. The ones I've seen look pretty good. They're not really as nice as the large 8.5 by 11 PDF versions of the files, which are available independently and by various pirate sources that I won't say anything more about at this stage, but I have also seen. But what I have here are the first printed copy prototypes of the 4 volumes that my publisher has been able to get out at a sort of rock-bottom price for me to have a look at as a proof copy.
Come on in, Julie. Just
let's invite Julie to come in. Pardon me?
Don't look at the books.
Right. Well, I'm kind of looking back and forth here. So Julie Loar is going to join me now, and she is my dear sweet lady who I'm actually collaborating with now on additional books that are on a similar subject, but somewhat more modern than these earlier narratives, the Billy Meier stories from the late 70s and early 80s and even into the early 90s when Volume 4 was finally published. But they came out remarkably well, I think, for everything that we have in this marvelous kind of golden age for publication right now for indie publications such as these. And it's a fabulous story. The Volume 1, it stands alone. The Volume 4 set together really covers one of the most remarkable stories, really, of the 20th century, or that anyone will ever find.
When will these be available in print and not just as a downloadable ebook?
Well, I probably need to go through them in detail as proof copies and try to fix a few minor problems. We have added quite a lot of supplementary material. We have done sessions ourselves, including our own contacts with Semjase, who has basically advised us on certain aspects of the original censorship that we were not sure about. And so these, I would say, are pretty bona fide reconstructions with many, many corrections. Many of the materials that Wendell had censored that in his day he was afraid to publish outrightly and openly because of retribution from various other sources that he was getting death threats about and things of that kind. But now, more than 30 years later, I think it's time for the world to really get the final version of the original manuscript with with a very small amount of censorship that really was unavoidable.
And someone can buy one when?
Well, I would think with any luck late this year or early next year, this year being now 2015 or early next year 2016. But this will probably be a print-on-demand project that I would hope to be able to facilitate for people who are interested, so that you can buy a single copy for a reasonable amount, which I would guess would be in the neighborhood of $50 a copy.
Yeah. So the full edition would be about $200.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell me more about Wendelle Stevens. You always hear the Billy Meier story, but not the Wendelle Stevens story.
Well, Wendell was my main man for many years. He was the person I call the Dean of UFO Studies, and that was Bob Dean's. One of his pals had sort of christened him with the Dean of UFO Studies, and that goes for me as well. Bob Dean said about Wendelle Stevens, he probably has forgotten more than most of us will ever know, and that was certainly true about UFO subjects, as he was the person that many people came to from around the world to advise them about going public with their stories, because he, as ex-military, had kind of walked the hard path on that.
He was a retired Air Force colonel, right? And,
he was a retired colonel, that's right.
Knew a lot from the inside, even when he was in the military, and then when he was out of the military and felt somewhat safe to proceed, then he began researching in earnest and sharing what he knew.
Yeah, he published probably somewhere between a dozen and maybe 16 books of independent stories of various UFO contactees around the world. The Billy Meier story, as I call it, is the crown and the jewel in the crown. The one that he spent the most amount of time, and he went over to Switzerland many times and spent time with Billy, and even in the early days, so we call that participant observation. He was there when it was happening, so he's the real authority, at least in the English language and of his day, of what really was going on. And he has, stated many, many times that he really never had any doubt about the authenticity of the Contact series that Billy was writing about.
Would it be true to say that this case is probably his most well-known research, but there were many others around the world, including one that was quite famous in South America with similar craft and similar looking ETs. This is the one that probably for Wendell.
Yeah, I'll never forget meeting a guy in the courtyard of the Cathedral of Cusco, describing those events that he had witnessed in the Amazon.
Exactly.
And that was in 1973. So this is almost contemporary to when.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now getting back to Wendell though, he has more books that you could republish.
Well, no, I wouldn't do that probably. His other books were not quite as distressed because they were not translated from Swiss German into English by a number of different people who had worked on them and sort of sliced them and diced them in various ways. And so they came out very uneven. Some of his later books, I think he kind of learned how to be a better publisher and editor himself, and had acquired collaborators.
Who's the present publisher of those books?
Well, those books are gone basically. His existing stock of published books, of print books, when the estate was settled after his death, went to his then current wife, who I think put them out to a UFO, fairly well-known UFO shopper, a job shopper, who managed to sell them all pretty quickly. So they're all gone basically, and it's hard to tell what will ever happen to them.
Well, I'm suggesting, by questioning, but why not just reissue them? I mean, under a new imprimatur.
Yeah, someone would have to sit down and really work them all over, which would take a fair amount of time. That remains for someone to do. Actually, Wendell's daughter, Cece Stevens, has the ebook rights to all of his existing books, and they managed to actually make photocopies of the books before Wendelle, passed, and so she has ebook rights to those existing books. But see, those books would have to be scanned, converted to computer files, and then re-edited, which is essentially what I did with these books. They were all scanned, converted from the original publication, but those are now computer files that can then be edited and re-edited and upgraded and produced with, in digital formats with more up-to-date techniques.
Yeah, speaking of that, you talked about translating the Swiss German and how difficult that was for the original edition. So tell me a little bit about your insight and your experience in doing that.
Well, Wendelle describes his misgivings about the various translators that he had found who were capable, as bilingual in Swiss German and English, but they always had their own bias, according to him. And so one was a theosophist and translated the Billy Meier material into theosophical language, which Wendelle found offensive, actually. He didn't like that, because he was sort of a straight-laced military scientist type of guy who was a real action hero in many ways. And he was very knowledgeable. He was into metaphysics and was very involved with certain kinds of channeling projects that he knew that he felt were authentic, but he didn't want it to get too airy-fairy. Even for him, astrology was a little bit on the edge of what he felt was acceptable. He was kind of like Carl Jung in some ways. He wanted it to be scientific and credible with a general audience rather than a metaphysical audience. So he had various people. One of his translators was essentially a religious-oriented person, a woman, who translated a lot of the material into what would have been acceptable to kind of church-type people who wanted a devotional attitude and approach, even though in many ways it really is not very sympathetic to that, because the Pleiadians were really quite critical of traditional religious approaches to their, our own biblical history as being distorted in ways that were magical, in ways that they felt were completely inappropriate. So he kind of left the three, from Volume 2 to Volume 4 were left in a relatively rough condition. Volume 2 was done pretty well. Volume 1 they spent the most amount of time trying to polish, and especially the first of the 10 contact reports were done pretty well, I would say, even though it was done by people whose first language was Swiss German and whose second acquired language for translation purposes was English. And so it was still rather awkward in terms of the actual style, rather than being sort of conversational the way American English would naturally be. And so I took all of that kind of stilted, what I call germ glaze, German and English put together, and because I had been quite familiar with it, and I had 30 years to think about it in between my first reading and my third or fourth readings of it, and put it together in what would be, I felt, appropriate conversational style for Semjase, which was something I think that was hard for the early people who didn't really speak English fluently themselves to be able to do. And so to me, to my ear, she sounds exactly like she would have sounded if she were actually speaking English, and that was my goal.
So what drew you to this? What was the seminal experience that caused you to be so attracted to this material?
Well, I had my own contact experiences around the same time, you see. And so I, as it turned out, had seen spacecraft that looked quite like the Pleiadian beam ship Variant 1. And so as soon as I saw these books with pictures of the same spacecraft, of course I was obsessed, and became quite involved. And it was a revelation because the story was the story that I needed to find out about myself. And so as time went on, there wasn't really anything else like it, which I rather quickly realized that was in the same category of extraordinary pictures, quite credible text, quite an amazing adventure story, or someone as impressive as Wendelle himself, who was an extremely dashing figure in his early days of running around to Switzerland back and forth and being extremely motivated to get this material out, which of course was the most amazing thing he had seen. And so he presented it to the world, and of course I was probably one of the most enthusiastic readers of the early books, and I got early copies myself, which are also quite valuable now. So when the time came 30 years later for me to think, okay, where's the second edition? It's time. for this book to be salvaged from the dustbin of history and of damaged publications, so that a new audience of people can now read it for the first time. And that was my goal. And so I finally decided, well, if nobody's going to do it, and after Wendelle released the original transliteration, as we call it, then I could actually take the two versions of the manuscript, compare them, and present and sort of integrate them with my own expertise of what had happened to me, because I'm also a contactee myself, as it turns out, from similar times and with similar individuals, to be able to be the person. And I felt that I was chosen in some ways to do this. And when I went to Wendelle and basically gave him my proposal, he was slightly overwhelmed and didn't imagine that it would ever really happen. But I could tell that in his final days he was satisfied that maybe I was finally going to be able to step in and pull off the second edition that he himself had decided that he was not able to do.
How has your life been transformed by this experience?
It's indeed the biggest identity shift that I've ever experienced, and as I have found out more and more, which is a fairly extraordinary story in itself, because these ETs are not anything that anybody knows about, most for the most part, or knows anything about that's realistic from the multiplex experience of the scary science fiction movies that we've all seen probably. But the time has come to really know who the ETs are and what their purposes are and what it is they would hope to have us accomplish here on Earth in the upcoming new century.
Ted?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, can you pull the covers up a little bit closer to the lens and talk about the technology? You were referring to robot craft or...
Well, what we were looking at before, of course, this is one of the most famous pictures on Volume 1 of the UFO contact from the Pleiades. This is the log pile of the trees that are on this little lonely road out in this Swiss forest. This is the Type 1 variation spacecraft, one of the most beautiful pictures that was laser scanned by Wendelle and probably has one of the most high-resolution quality images that Billy was able to ever come up with. One of his very early pictures, he had a film camera that was stuck in the infinite focus position, so he couldn't take close-ups, but all of these distant shots were really quite impressive. This is probably the most famous picture that the people in Switzerland loved. This is another marvelous picture. This is the Volume 2 cover, dust jacket cover of his Contact from the Pleiades Volume 2. This shows, I think it's, this might be the Variation 2 ship. It's hard to tell them apart. They're slightly different, the two spacecraft here. But this one has a companion robocraft with it that is has just enough room for one single human passenger, even though normally it doesn't have any passengers. It's controlled remotely from the mothership here. And these usually come in pairs. And these are the kind of little gopher craft that they actually send out on missions to do various things of surveillance and reconnaissance that are remote from them, so they can be anywhere they need to be, that may be anywhere, either in the vicinity or quite remotely on different planets or whatever it might be. And these robocraft are kind of the eyes and ears that they have that are on site, that are actually with invisibility shielding, usually able to monitor anything that they're quite interested in keeping track of at a distance. And so they have any number of these that they can bring out to do whatever it is, and many times they have these assigned to different people that they're monitoring for various reasons.
And it said, if I recall, that the ships themselves have a level of intelligence.
Well, they're some kind of super alloy of noble metals and stainless steels that do have some kind of psychoactive component that the person, it's like having your fingerprint, on your cell phone or something like that. If they're assigned to you, they can only be commanded by yourself and by your consciousness sort of signature. But they can also be operated, probably electronically, remotely as well. But they can be, Billy was sort of mischievous, and so he, with his level of developed consciousness, could actually redirect them in the sky, which he did from time to time to Semjase's consternation. And so she, really told him, stop playing with these little spacecraft. We have them there for a reason. They're getting confused. They could run into each other, and then it would really be a big problem. So that is the case, and they have, little telemeter discs that are little tiny things that they can put on site to monitor any individual. They have these intermediate-sized spacecraft. They have the Explorer-sized spacecraft, which are about.
Oh yeah, give me that title. Pick up the book, and so
yeah,
I can
okay.
zoom. Yeah.
Well, this was the variation of 3 spacecraft or 4. It's a little bit hard to tell here. This is probably Wendell's favorite picture of all time, which is the reason it's on volume 1 on the cover. But this spacecraft, is one of the ones like the first and second variation spacecraft, the third and fourth variation spacecraft, could time travel. They were about 7 meters in diameter. They could transport 3 people very comfortably on very comfortable chairs. They had all kinds of high-tech equipment beyond our dreams that we could possibly imagine, with all kinds of 3-dimensional imaging that they could be monitoring people. They could be looking at all sorts of distant, remote locations. They could monitor the atmosphere in color codes through the ports on the upper part of the spacecraft, the portholes, to determine whether they were in a safe environment and so forth. But this is, one of the crew. This was either Semjase in her spacecraft, or it was her station commander, Quetzal. I think this one was actually Quetzal who was there that day. And so they would fly these spacecraft for Billy to photograph. It would all be set up, just like you're set up with your camera today. Billy also had motion video cameras. He had still cameras. And so they would take a bunch of pictures. He would take a bunch of pictures that would be posed. And then they would land the spacecraft, and then they would have a meeting and talk about what was going on that was important. And then typically they would take off in their spacecraft, and Billy would get back on his little motorcycle and probably drive maybe 5 miles back to the location where his people from his group would be waiting for him. And they would all go back and have a big cup of coffee and talk about the excitement of that day's meeting. And then a little bit later, either that day or the next day, they would transmit the verbatim transcript of what had actually happened at the meeting between him and whoever was meeting.
What was Billy recording with a reel-to-reel tape recorder, or?
No, it wasn't recorded with mechanical devices. No, actually, the Pleiadians have a technology that would allow them to automatically record Semjase's consciousness of the conversation, and then they would actually extract that from her.
Download it.
From her memory. That's right. They would download from her memory, and then they would transmit that code, and then Billy would type with one hand. He was only a one-armed man. His left arm had been lost in an accident some years earlier. But he would type at very, very high speed, 60 words a minute, on his typewriter to actually produce the transcript, which was kind of automatic. He was aware of it, but he would be sent images somehow that he would translate himself into the context of the transcript. So it would be a verbatim transcript, and he would have to work very, very hard for like 4 hours continuously to actually get it down. So
There's
that was all
videos of him doing that, right?
And there are videos of that, and recordings and so forth. So this was all done in Swiss German. The original transcripts were all done in Swiss German, and then people in his group, and the identity of this person was kind of unknown up until volume 4, in which it's essentially revealed as one of the people in the group. So one of the people in the group really wanted to do an English version because Swiss German is a relatively obscure language, even for the German-speaking people. We would think of it as kind of like a southern dialect in North America, a southern states dialect. So that's what finally they spent a number of years. Wendell probably spent 8 or 10 years trying to get the translations done, and then he finally sort of gave up and published what he had, and he didn't really spend very much time working on Volume 4. And Volume 3 was probably the roughest one and the hardest one for me to actually do the transliteration in English myself, to render it into idiomatic American English, which was my main task. And I love the way it came out. I mean, I spent 5 years working on it, and so I went, I crawled over it for a very long time and felt like that it had to be the level that I felt was right myself before I could actually decide that it was actually finished. So I love the story in Volume 1 for new readers to look at first, because
someplace and smile at him.
It's thank you. It's fairly complete in itself, and would be a very good starting point for anybody who feels they have any interest at all in this particular narrative.
Well, I have one final question, which for my own satisfaction. Did Wendell ever take the time to go out to Giant Rock Airport to see George Van Tassel?
That's a good question.
Well, I know he knew about that part of it. I mean, he knew about anything that was happening in his region, to be sure. I don't remember him mentioning George Van Tassel. He felt that Adamski was authentic and different quite substantially with Semjase, who goes to some extensive lengths to discredit Adamski as a faker, basically, as a wannabe UFO contactee person. And I would say, I mean, for my part, her evidence is persuasive, but Wendell was not persuaded for whatever reason he might have had. And now, Semjase and the Pleiadians, they thought Wendell had been tricked a number of times, actually, by some of the people who had come to him with seeming credible evidence of contact stories. But they felt that some of the stories were really very elaborately faked, as the Adamski evidence had been. And I think that's probably correct.
Well, I think that what George Van Tassel supposedly received and didn't write himself, the Council of Seven Lights, does stand on its own. And you know, it was hard to imagine that being an elaborate fake, but maybe it was.
I'm not really familiar with that story so much. I know in the early days there were, I mean, in Volume 2 there's an elaborate, like almost a database of contactees that Semjase mentions and gives to Billy, and gives an indication of whether the Pleiadians felt that they were authentic or not. And many of them weren't. And many of them were quite elaborate hoaxes that people had come up with, who seemed to have a kind of compulsive need to be contactees. So there's a powerful wannabe complex of wannabe contactees out there who are people who heard about the authentic stories, and felt that they couldn't be left out, that they had to have some participation with that. And so I have run across many kinds of people with many kinds of experiences. Being a contactee myself, I mean, my story is not an abduction story, but really is a contactee story in which I have had close encounters, I've had distant encounters, I've had extraordinary stories, even from my childhood, of having contacts with birds that seem to have been ways that the ETs have been able to contact me and work with me in ways that I wouldn't have been frightened as a child. And so that has continued into the present time. And now that I know so much more about it, since I've met Julie and we've been working together on our projects, it's like the whole sky has opened, and they have revealed in our maturity now much of what was very confusing to me in earlier times. So I've had probably about the last 5 to 7 years in which a completely new chapter has opened for me, as I have actually made the commitment to go in and decode these books for a general audience. Because the time has come in this age of disclosure, which we believe we now have, that people are going to be able to find out generally in a way that's not frightening, in a way that's not somehow being used for nefarious purposes, of what really they would like to have happen in terms of the ET civilizations being able to come into the Earth in a more open way and have a positive effect, rather than have the military, go crazy and have people, especially some of the more religious people who expect that this would have to come with Jesus and everything, not go ballistic in various ways with, destructive reactions of various kinds.
Well, how does Julie's collaboration with you change this picture?
Well, we'd need a big story to tell. We need some time and space to tell that story, but
yeah, next chapter.
It turns out that we have both been contactees our whole lives, and it slowly dawned on us in various ways what was happening. And it wasn't until that we could actually get together ourselves and collaborate that they felt confident that we were both mature enough to actually go to the next stage of openly revealing really what had been happening our whole lives. And so now, after the Billy Meier project has gotten finished, we have been working on our own 5-volume series now that's well along, and the first volume is about to be published, in which we will be revealing the next stage of what the Pleiadians and some of the other ET civilizations have in store for us, and what they expect will be happening and what they would like the people, the public, to know about what their technologies are like and what they have planned for people such as ourselves. And there are probably as many as 1,000 people like ourselves that they are grooming to actually be their ambassadors to the earth, to actually reveal the story. And she would probably like to say something too.
In short, the frame of the work that we're doing explains the role of 5 primary ET races who have had significant roles populating the earth, gardening the earth in terms of descendants for probably 500,000 to 1 million years, and explaining their role. Beings from the stars have been visiting Earth for at least that long, some only with curiosity, some with longer, larger intentions, and that's the frame of this story, how that's working and how we're a small part of a large project.
Well, this is interesting, Julie, because I've known you, for now about 15 years, and this is the first time I've heard about this. So you really are on the brink of letting the world know of, and your role as a medium. How does that work? I mean, are you conscious when you receive contact telepathically, or?
Well, kind of the answer to the first part is I always knew in my life I was having a lot of strange experiences, unusual experiences. Likewise, birds also would come as messengers that have been decoded later. And I was very uncomfortable with ever revealing that because I always felt quite unusual and didn't wish to disclose it. I've walked through that portal, however, and now I'm ready to do so. Yes, I am conscious. I would prefer not to be in a state that I do not wish to be an unconscious channel. So I'm fully conscious. I don't always remember everything clearly, but after our 3rd experiment, we started recording it and Ted started transcribing it. So it's an extraordinary experience for me that I probably have equal amounts awe, humility, and terror.
Julie is very discreet, has been very discreet about all this until finally stepping forward recently, as she will be probably more able and willing to do.
Yeah, and you're intending to do a publication of your joint, your collaborative work now.
The first volume, Star Table Transmissions, is just about to emerge. Yeah,
he has finished. A deadline of the end of the month to get a special deal from the publisher.
We've got about 2 more weeks, but it's
yeah, really.
The only thing that remains is a few additions to the cover.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fabulous interview. So and we won't labor it any further. So thanks again, and then let's do some photography.
It was a good run through for a start. So good. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
I know. They got started with